very much, sir, for the introduction.
No worries. So, yes, and one way to study the structure of a system is, of course, to try to represent them using combinatorial objects, such as graphs, hypergraphs, or simple complexes. And of course, like recently, there's been an increased interest in higher order interaction, higher order structures. And the idea is that graphs are, of course, sort of limited to modeling pairwise interactions, right? So even if you have a triangle, you're only really looking at pairwise interactions and not necessarily at three-ways interactions. So if the three members of the triangle are doing something really together in a sort of synergistic way, you wouldn't necessarily be able to capture that in a single triangle. But at the same time, a triangle itself is a cycle, right? And that's the smallest cycle you can have, and you can have larger cycles. And in a sense, you can consider the existence of a cycle as a higher order object because it combines, it's a particular structure that combines a set of nodes in a particular way, right? And also cycles are also called poles in homology, and they naturally come when you try to characterize simple complexes, which are themselves ways or models for higher order interactions, right? And of course, when you start introducing new types of ways of representing or new ways of representing systems, you want to ensure that it actually has an impact on, for example, the dynamics. In my case, that's what I'm interested in, right? So for example, there's been many extensions of traditional models that are well studied to higher order and simplified models like SIR type of dynamics, like the simulation model by Petri and colleagues. And of course, the Kuramoto model being this sort of quintessential synchronization model, or model that you use to look for synchronizations. It's been extended to simple models, first by Milan and Bianconi, and then with some colleagues, we tried to extend that to have to include frustration in the model. So you tend not to have dynamic that necessarily converges to equilibrium, but you have this frustration parameter that essentially goes or tries to convince the spins not to align themselves, and that gives rise to rich dynamics. And in particular, you can see that when you start having these high order interactions, you get when you consider high order interactions in simple and true faces and simple complexes, you get a whole new zoology of behaviors that are not fully characterized yet, of course, but phenomenologically you can explore that and see many differences. And when you look at sort of, this is one of the almost the simplest example of what you can consider like a simple complex where you have like the triangles with three faces, and the oscillators are on the edges, so they can interact both through the nodes and through the face. Right? So that's a very simple example, but then what really, when it gets really interesting is when we get to the larger, more complex complexes, right? And in particular, when you have holes that are present, right? Because these holes, they have a meaning for the dynamics, right? Because the dynamics of the Kuramoto model close to synchronization is essentially a diffusion dynamics like that is modeled by the Laplacian. And the steady states will be determined by the kernel of the Laplacian. And when you consider interaction on edges, the kernel is actually the number, or the dimension of the kernel rather, is the number of cycles that are present in your system, right? The analogy with, well, not the analogy, but the correspondence in the node Kuramoto being that the null space of the Laplacian, of the zero Laplacian, is the constant vector, which means that you synchronize, that in the steady state, you're going to synchronize to the constant eigenvector. Right? So why am I saying all that? Because this is essentially just to highlight the fact that holes naturally coming as sort of higher order objects, or that help you characterize higher order objects and potentially the dynamics that is happening on these complex structures. So holes themselves have a meaning and have interesting properties, right? And simple complexes are naturally oriented, and the orientation is, in principle, just a mathematical idea. Like you don't need it doesn't mean anything in terms of the dynamics, really. But well, not really, but it's a whole other topic. So let's assume the orientation is just here because you need it, right? But another way of looking at this is to think, okay, instead of orientation, you could consider direction, right? And then this is what often happens when you consider data and the representation and metadata associated with that representation, right? Is it's either you often keep the different types of data in different silos that don't really talk to each other, or you try to put everything together in a super complicated model. And this is not just when you do theoretical work, but this is also very true in so my sort of health informatics practice, right? You have where you have records for patients and patient characteristics that are the lifestyle, the diagnosis, everything. And in the traditional sort of epidemiological approach, you tend to have very siloed representation of patients. And what we're trying to do is actually to combine these different silos and make them talk together. But you need to do it, of course, in a way that is meaningful, that is actually helpful and doesn't just create an over complex representation of your system that you can then that you're very limited to with what you can do this afterwards. So the idea is to sort of try and that was actually one of our starting points. We had several starting points and they eventually converged together. But the idea was, instead of amalgamating all the data together, we want to consider sort of layers of data and see how they can communicate. And actually, often we were wondering, like, what's the difference between a graph and a network? And in a sense, we would say like a complex network is a graph with some metadata attached to it, right, that sort of enriched the representation. And this is essentially what we've been trying to do with directed graphs, right? But what is also interesting and that you can do sorry, is that you can then use the different layers of data and use that to enrich the representation of your system and combine that in ways to gain further insight. So again, looking at holes in simple representation of systems, then you can gain more insights into the dynamics of brains and the psychedelics in that case. But really what we're interested in, it was something much less sophisticated than all this. And we just wanted to consider directed networks as undirected graphs with directionality information. Right, so this is the main idea essentially behind our work. And the other question that was sort of going there is that, okay, so that's one way of considering directed graphs. But then what can we also try to think about ways of characterizing the treeness of a graph, right? Because at the end of the day, a graph with cycles is just a tree with cycles that are connected together, right? And the reason we considered that was because Viva and Tim, Viva spent her whole PhD looking at DAGS, so Directed Acyclic Graphs. And one of the questions she has was exactly this one. So can we quantify the treeness of a graph, or how far from a tree a graph is? And maybe actually I presented it in reverse. I should have started with that and then say like how we consider directed graphs as undirected graph plus the directionality information to try to answer that question. So essentially we want to find ways of measuring the cyclicity or the non-treeness of a graph and try to use that to characterize the system that it represents. And so first we need to define what cycles are, right? And probably everybody knows what a directed cycle is, which is essentially a set of nodes that are connected by edges. And you have a directed cycle if you can start from a node and go back to that same node following the direction of the edges, right? And in that example, then you see that you have essentially three of them, right? There's three ways you can start from the bottom nodes and go back to it. Right? But now, if you look at the undirected graph that is underpinning that directed one, then you see that you have that you can find other cycles that when you map them onto with the direction, or when you enrich the representation with the direction, they're not directed cycles as such, because obviously they don't form loops. But in a sense, they're still cycles, right? They're not cycles in the sense of the directed cycle, but they still, for example, close path. If you consider these to be wedge, you can see that there are two paths that then combine together. And actually, they're all examples of that. So this was this observation that led us to this question of maybe there's more to DAGS than just no cycles, right? Maybe there's some structure that we can think of trying to characterize and understand what they mean. And what we actually found out was there's only four classes of such cycles, right? And I'm just going to sketch very quickly the idea behind the proof. I mean, what is the proof for the physicists? And it all hinges on 2 points, on two operations. First is the edge direction reversal. So you just take an edge and you flip it. And this essentially allows you to take a neutral wedge. So you have an arm of the path, and creating a source wedge if you flip the edge on the left, or a sink wedge when you flip the edge on the right. And what happens when you perform that operation on a directed graph is that by flipping that edge left, then you're essentially making that graph first not a directed cycle anymore, but you also create a pair of sink and source nodes, right? So this is the first thing that we notice. Actually, they always go in pair, right? So there's almost like you have creation and negation types, right? And then when you're in that position where you have that pair of source and sink nodes, you can try the further, right? So you can flip that edge, and if you flip that edge, then what you essentially do is that you have the source node that moves around. So the structure is only marginally different but here you have direct connection between the source and the sink node, and here it becomes, right? But if you flip the other edge, or one of the other edges, the one on the left, then because you're flipping an edge on a neutral wedge, then you naturally create another pair of source and sink nodes. And once you're here, then you're a bit stuck, right? Because if you flip any edge, then you're going to kill a pair of one source node, and you're going to go back to that situation. And once you're here, then you can continue flipping things, but then the only thing you're going to be achieving is moving the source nodes up, and then eventually manipulate it back to the directed graphs. So our idea was essentially to start from the directed cycle and see by just flipping edges what were the properties that was emerging. And it turns out that this is really, in a sense, here you have 4 types of, let's say, generalized directed cycles. And the property they have here are essentially all you need to characterize these classes. And by that, what I mean is that even if you increase the size of your cycles, so you go from 4 to 5, for example, by just adding an edge, a node on an edge, so you create a neutral wedge. So creating a neutral wedge doesn't cost you anything, right? You're not sort of interfering with the sync source structure of the thing. You're just making it larger, your cycle larger. And essentially, if you add nodes, add nodes essentially, so you increase the length of the different cycles, and you're not perturbing the source sync relationship or the number of source sync nodes that you have, and you end up with these 4 classes. I mean, that one is a bit different, and I'm going to spend maybe a bit more time just talking about this one. But the other one, they very well, right? So you have directed cycles, which have no sync source pair. Then you have the shortcuts that you obtain by just flipping one edge. So you have one pair of source sync nodes that are directly connected, and we call it shortcut because, well, I mean, it's pretty obvious, like you have the direct path from the source of the sync. And also they have a property that we're going to be, that I'm going to refer to later in the context of DAGS, is that they're transitively reducible. And then we have what we initially called diamonds. Also, the reason why we did that is obscure now. But the essential idea is that you have, it's like a shortcut cycle, but with no direct connection between source and sync. And then you have the mixers. And these ones, the reason we call them mixers is also fairly obvious. It's because if you take the 4 mixer cycle that we had here at the bottom, and you just rearrange its sort of representation, then you see that you have 2 sources nodes that connect to 2 sync nodes in a way that they essentially mix. Like if you think of source as sources of information, then they're essentially mixing their information to the sync node. So the sync node receive information from 2 different sources. While in the shortcuts and the diamonds, you don't have this notion, right? You might have distortion of information, but essentially the information that is going onto, like, going through the 2 arms is essentially the same at the beginning. Right? And it turns out that you cannot, like using the 2 operations we used, you cannot construct anything else that wouldn't fit in any of these categories. And what I mentioned about the mixers being slightly different is that, of course, as you increase the number of nodes in your cycles, you can keep flipping edges to create pair nodes, pairs of sync nodes, pairs of source and sync nodes, right? So the mixers is essentially a class that's where you can have any number of source and sync pairs, but in a way that mixes the information. So essentially what you would do is you would add like another source and sync pair in that representation, and they would sort of keep mixing pairwise the information. Right, so yeah, so if you have any questions or anything is unclear, just please stop.
Why did you think it would shortcut and diamond? Right?
Yes, almost, but when you consider DAGs, you can also consider, and I talk about that later, is that you have an operation that's called transitive reduction that preserves the connectivity of the graph, but removes all shortcuts essentially.
Okay.
So yeah, so that's that's not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons.
Okay.
And that's the reason we actually that's our main reason, is because you can remove them without changing the connectivity structure of the graph. While if you remove that edge here, then suddenly these two nodes, they're not connected anymore because you cannot split from one to the other. So there are special cases of diamonds. So initially the construction, we started from triangles, and in a triangle, of course, like a diamond and shortcuts is the same, right? And you can't have mixes in triangles, so it made more sense to start with a full graph with 4 nodes, and because you have a representative of each class, and then you can show that you can reconstruct more classes. Yeah, so essentially we ended up with this sort of generalized directed cycles. So because Tim was very clear that he didn't want them to be called directed cycles because they're not directed cycles. So we call them generalized. Might not be the best term either, but yeah, I guess somebody will always take offense at naming, so we just went for that. So that's only one step, right? So and to construct that, we essentially used one of our questions, or one of our ideas, which was this idea of considering layers of information, right? So we have an underlying undirected graphs and a graph, and then a layer of directionality information. And to operate or define these generalized cycles, we essentially consider the mixture of, well, the undirected graph, and then find the cycles in them and characterize them with the direction. But now if we want to sort of go into the second question, which was how tree-like the graph is, then we need not just to be able to characterize the different types of cycles, but also to find them. And to do that, again, we're going to stay at the underlying layers, so the undirected graph level, and look for cycle basis, right? So it's fairly easy to convince oneself that that not all cycles are independent. So as soon as you have two cycles that share an edge, then you have essentially 3 cycles, and you can express themselves in terms of each other. So you have so what I mean is, yeah, sorry, I think I have a slide for that. Yes, so that might be clearer. Right, so if you have that cycle and you add that cycle, then essentially it's an operation modulo 2, right? So you have that edge that becomes redundant, and here's we have another cycle, right? And then a very natural property of this ability to combine cycles is that they can form a vector space. And the dimension of that vector space is well known in different fields. So in homology, we call that third Betti number. So that goes back to what I talked about initially about symmetry complexes and the holes. So that would be the number of holes is the dimension of the kernel of the Laplacian, and that's the Betti number 1. And there's also that equation where the number of nodes is the number of edges minus the number of cycles is number of edge minus number of nodes plus number of connected components. And that has a name as well, which escapes me at the moment. But it is another sort of well-known property of graphs that's going to come back to. But essentially, the idea is then that when you have an undirected graph, you can find a vector space that underlies all the cycles in that graph. And the idea was to essentially use that as a representation of the cyclicity of a graph. There's, of course, no unicity. I mean, it's very rare that you have a unicity of the cycle basis. The only case, I think, where you have unicity of the cycle basis is where you have no cycles that share any edges, right? Because as soon as they share edge, then you can express one in terms of the other. But if they're all isolated, then they can communicate. So the dimension of the space of the sets of cycle bases can be fairly large in real life. So one way of reducing the dimension or reducing the number of choices we have to choose a representative of the representation or representativity of the cyclicity of the graph is to use to add a constraint on the cycle basis, where we ask that it's minimal. And by minimal, we mean that the length of all the cycles in that basis is the shortest possible. And in terms of the philosophy underlying a question, that also goes with this idea that we're looking for deviation from treeness. So what's the minimum? So there's a notion of minimality in the question of how close to a tree you are, right? And that's going to come back again with this notion of transitive reduction that I will talk about in a minute. So what we liked is that this minimal cycle basis sort of gives you a sort of compressed representation, compressed in terms of length or number of information you need to describe the cyclic structure of your graph. And now we come to the point where we can discuss DAGS and the intersection between DAGS and generalized cycles, right? So DAGS, directed acyclic graphs, by definition, they don't have directed cycles. But as we've seen, we can consider other types of cyclic structure in the underlying undirected graph and sort of decorate it with directionality information that allows us to talk about certain types of cyclic structure in graphs. So we can in directed acyclic graphs. So as I said, so no directed graph, but shortcuts, diamonds, and mixes are all allowed in DAGS. One thing that is also important with DAGS is that they follow a hierarchy, right? So you can always, and that's directly related to this notion that you have no directed graph, so you cannot go back where you started from, right? So you have this notion of strict hierarchy that allows you to have an ordering or pseudo ordering on the nodes, right? And what we then considered was this idea of transitive reduction, right? Which is again another tool that we can use to try to get the minimal cyclic, or try to capture the minimal cyclic information that you have in the graph, right? And what transitive reduction does is that it removes all edges that do not break reachability. So it's not just a connectivity question, so it's really a reachability question, right? So if we remove that edge, we can still go from that node to the top, right? Just by going a longer path, but you can still do it. So another way of looking at transitive reduction is to think of it as preserving the longest path. So instead of, often people are interested in the shortest path between nodes, but by essentially using transitive reduction, you find the longest path in the graph. So yes. And then by definition, transitively reduced DAGs don't have shortcuts. So we're down to two types of cycles, or generalized cycles. And this is good for multiple reasons. First, we have a sort of minimalistic representation of the reachability of nodes in the graph, which means also we have the sort of least types of cycles that we can consider, because we know we don't have direct cycles. We know we also eliminate all the shortcut cycles. So in terms of characterization, it sort of reduces the space or the number of parameters that we can measure, right? To characterize the cyclic structure of transitively reduced DAGs. So yeah, maybe I'm just going to sort of summarize a bit the pipeline. So how do we go from a graph or a directed graph to the sort of minimal representation of its cyclic structure, and then so that's the sort of minimal cyclic basis of the transitive reduction of a directed graph, directed acyclic graphs. So again, to reiterate, the basic idea is to consider a directed graph or a directed acyclic graph in that case as an undirected graph with a partial order, which allows us to construct a DAG. And we then transitively reduce that DAG to remove all shortcut cycles. We then remove the direction because we don't need it anymore, because we want to find the cycle basis in the undirected graph for various reasons. We want actually to do that because it's essentially boils down to it's easier than in a directed graph. So you can, so there are notions of directed cycle basis, but it's not very clear. So there are theoretical results, so we could find theoretical results, how to find them. But in terms of implementation, like algorithmic implementation, the only ones we could find were by people who published these papers and were proprietary. So we had to pay to get the software. So they were actually use that in commercial applications. And we didn't really feel like we could re-implement that for us. While cycle basis are algorithms to find cycle basis and minimum cycle basis are available in network DAGS. So you can just plug and play, and it's very easy to compute. Yeah, so then we find the minimal cycle basis, and then we reapply the sort of direction information or the layer the information about the direction, and now we can look at the properties of these cycles and essentially characterize the cyclic structure of transitively reduced cyclic graphs.
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
By the time it's transitive to transitive reduction, so there will not be any triangle, I guess, in the undirected.
Yeah.
Yes. And so you think that there won't be any triangle either in the basis. So there is no triangle.
Yeah, that's right.
And so does it have any implications on, I don't know, on the kind of cycles that are possible in the graph? Because they could forbid the existence of any triangle there.
So what do you mean, like, does it add or remove a constraint?
Well, I think it's related to the question. Well, here you decide to remove the triangles, but if you had kept them, you have another bit. No?
Yes, and we will have absolutely.
And so what would be the justification for throwing them away?
So the justification was, so we wanted to sort of get the minimal representation of the cycle in a graph that conserved the reachability criteria.
Okay, that's
That was it.
Is any other application in that, but it's not necessarily.
So Tim and Viola, they've done a lot of work on looking at exactly what happens to DAGs when you transitively reduce the centralities in citation networks and so on. And they argue that actually the information that is contained, like, they ask the question, like, whether the information that is contained in all these direct links, how is it really relevant to measure certain types of properties? For example, if you want to see how, so in citation networks, if you want to see how widespread, like actually what is the sort of the reach of a paper. So you don't just want to count all the citations, but also to see where they are coming from. So are they coming from different fields? So what is the sort of indirect ancestry of the paper? Yeah, and I think also it's related also to a more general question. So how do you reduce the dimensionality of an object, and what does it what does it capture as in terms of information? Well, like what is preserved, what is not preserved, and you can wonder what is thrown away. How relevant is that really to work in the system? Because there's also one thing is that even though it's so algorithms to find universal basis are implemented, they become really costly to run as the size of the system increases. So reducing the size of the system in that sense allows you to consider large graphs on your laptop rather than going supercomputer in real life. So this is actually something we wanted to explore a bit more, is what is the effect of transitive reduction, but we didn't really have time yet, because there's also a relationship between the cycle basis of all these and homology and persistent homology. That's because you're essentially finding a homology basis for your system. So if you think of simple complexes, for example, as representation of a data set, that you can, if you can endow it with a pseudo order, then you can suddenly do a transitive reduction, and that's going to have an effect on the homological characterization of your system. And we wanted to, I mean, we would have liked to explore that a bit more, this connection between homology basis and cycle basis in transitive reduction, but we didn't have time to do that yet.
Can I just ask another question? Yeah. Sorry. So when you have a diagram, basically you have a source, a sink, then you have two paths, right?
Yeah.
And the minus have a stiffness. Yeah. So are there studies that explore what is the different types of like imbalance that you have between one leg and the other leg that go between these two extreme modes? I think you have to throw away the one where you have one and something else.
Yeah.
But do you have are there some models that investigate that this kind of distribution of like putting a certain L1 and L2 that form basically a cycle together?
Yeah. So indirectly, yes, that's something we did just after. I think that's a nice segue into this actually.
Oh, yeah.
So because so I'm going to answer your question by so once you have a cycle basis and you can know the different types of the prevalence of each type of cycles you have. But these cycles themselves, they have properties, like as you said, for example, like they can be a sort of imbalance. So that's the balance. I mean, it's a bit cryptic, but essentially, yes, we're looking at the distribution of imbalance. So if both arms are the same way, then you're going to have something that's zero. But when it goes in one direction or another, and you have distribution of that, you can measure what's the distribution of that in your system. And cycle size and type, because like you can have diamonds or cycles of any size, but they can also be very short. And because in DAGS you have notion of chronology order, so you have height associated with cycles, and particularly like what's the difference between the age of the sync node, of the source node and the sync node. So how stretched they are as well in the network. And so these are all sort of node-centered or node-based characteristics, but you can also ask how they are organized in the graph, right? So are they all sort of clustered together? Are they really spread apart? So what's the sort of interactions? And you can sort of get ideas about the distribution in the network by looking at at the spectral properties of the edge-edge interaction matrix, or rather not the so you have an edge cycle incidence matrix, and then you look at the covariance of that, and then it's like analyzing the covariance matrix. So yeah, maybe this is again in continuation, and we maybe answer more questions. So we didn't look at any real life examples, but we looked at very specific models, which are all DAGs, and the simplest one is a lattice. Well, that's lattice, and then we have a sort of rational, which is also lattice-like, but with a slightly different organization, where you have a cycle within a cycle within a cycle within a cycle. And these are sort of all tractable analytically. But then in terms of sort of more network models, we looked at heterophony DAGs, where essentially you create an heterophony DAG first, and then you assign a sort of time to each node, and that gives you the direction of the edges of the edge between two nodes. And finally, the price model, which is essentially a directed version of the Barabasi-Albert's model. And if I'm not wrong, it actually predates it. It's from the 70s originally. And then, funnily enough, I think it was developed to look at citation networks. And so the result for the lattice and the rational, they sort of expected, and they're not super interesting. But although we don't really necessarily understand why, so it's a bit phenomenological, right? So we generate models and we measure the properties, but we don't necessarily know why they turn out this way, but we can observe differences. So for example, for comparison, so these are results for heterophony graphs and price models that have the same density of links post-transitive reduction. So in that sense, they're comparable. And if you look at the relative prevalence of diamonds and mixes, for example, the heterophony model overwhelmingly have diamonds, while it's much more balanced in the price model. Again, we're not sure why, but it's an interesting observation. And the average heights of the cycles in the price model, they're much more compressed, and that's I think a direct consequence of the preferential attachment, right? So you're going to first sort of have this very compact cycle, while in the round graph you have no constraints. So essentially you can connect very far in the system, particularly because the sort of time and connectivity are completely uncorrelated in the heterophony, because from two different random processes, while in the price model there's a correlation between them, right? Because time is correlated with how you connect you know to the network. And so where do we go from there? So there's a lot of open questions that we have and things that we want to look at, but I think this relationship between dynamic and structure is something that we really would like to understand more. So, for example, if you run, let's say, the Kuramoto model on an heterophony and a price model, how are the dynamics going to be different? And in particular, what's going to be the relative influence of these two types of graphs, right? Which are either cycles. Sorry. So the diamonds, they look at the sort of resilience of the network, right? So you can kill an arm, but you will still have a way to connect. While in the mixes, you're really looking at mixing frequencies, for example, if you have oscillators. And what we're trying to do at the moment is essentially look at pseudo DAGs, because we need the feedback, because otherwise the stationary state would be completely trivial. But have sort of super loops made of smaller cycles, and trying to understand how the prevalence of these diamonds versus mixed loops cycles influence the steady state of the dynamic. Like particularly when they reach a steady state, so they have the same level of synchronization. What is actually happening underneath? So how is that level of synchronization sustained? Is it sustained differently in the two topologies, right? And because if you just look at the all the parameters, the level of synchronization, they're going to look the same. But actually, when you look at information-based measures of the time series of the oscillators, then they start to look slightly different, right? Actually, a bit more than slightly, but it's yeah, it's something that unfortunately it's actually it's running at the moment. So we have preliminary results, but nothing that I would dare showing. Yeah, so this is yeah, more or less everything I want to say. So again, so some people might not really think we talk about generalized directed cycles, but we think it's at least justifiable by thinking of these decoupling between the underlying undirected structure and the extra information that the directionality brings in. There's only 4 classes of directed cycles, which is, I guess, quite nice, because there's enough. It's not like it increases with the size of the network. We know that we can always characterize each cycle in one of these classes. And we have proposed some metrics. I mean, arguably very basic, but try to capture some difference in the organization of different bubbles. And what is actually really interesting, I think, is the next step is in understanding how these differences, these structural differences relate to dynamical as a similarity of differences, and partly how you sustain activity differently, maybe in different types of class. And there's a lot more details that I didn't cover here because yeah, there's essentially a lot. But this is a long paper, but there's probably more. There's a lot more description about the heterofreni transitive reduced DAGs and these properties that also we think might be interesting to look at very, very carefully. We have some preliminary results that we present here, but nothing, not a theory as all. Yeah, so if you're curious and want to know more, please go there. And yeah, and I think that's what I wanted to say today.
Thanks for the talk. It's great. So did you do in the paper, did you try looking at some of these statistics without doing the transitive reduction? And just also maybe a specific question, is the number of edges removed by the transitive reduction the same as the number of shortcuts that would be in the whole thing, or can an edge participate in more than one shortcut?
Okay, so first question, because the easiest one is no, we didn't, and exactly because we sort of needed to re-intense what we wanted to do, because it's already a long paper, at least to my standards, and we had to cut a lot of material, so to speak, and we had to decide on what to do.
So you can maybe have a whole paper on just shortcuts.
Yes, and I think that the direction we would go wouldn't just to look at shortcut, but actually in a more general context in dimensions reduction and how faithfully we can represent, let's say, a data set or a system, and simplifying its representation. So that would probably be the angle we go to. But yeah, we didn't have time to do that yet. And The second question, sorry, could you?
So I was just thinking, it's fine if you don't have an answer off the top of your head, but with the number of edges removed by the transitive reduction be the same as the number of shortcuts in DAG.
No, because no, I don't think so. So if I understand correctly, so if you have, let's say you have a diamond like this, and you have a short bit in the middle,
Yep.
Then you essentially have
That would be, yeah. So one edge can participate in more than one shortcut.
Yeah. I'm not going to go it because
Yeah.
I don't have a whiteboard in our new office. I'm just very close. So use two colors. So yeah. So here you have like 2 4-step cycles. And if you remove that one, then you use 2. And but that's actually that's something also that we looked at briefly. That is not in paper. Is how that changes the dimension of the cyclic basis, the operation of transitive reduction. Yeah, because it has a relationship with the best number and the homology and all this. And yeah, I don't remember of its price, everything, but there's sort of rules that you can derive and like yeah, how much it increases or decreases. And it's not as simple as it looks, but I think we found some systematic way of counting.
Thanks.
I have one naive question, really, like in terms of real-world networks or like data sets. Have you thought of like any applications? I don't know why brain networks keep popping into my head, like structural connectivity, like literally connections between brain areas and things like that. I don't know whether it's something that you consider at some point, or if you have any application in mind.
Yeah, so neuroscience would be really nice to tap into, because that's underlying. I mean, I've been doing quite a lot of it. The only problem is with the directionality that you get, because so if you just have structured data, it's not really clear in which direction you go. Now you can look at, but that's kind of mesoscopic macroscopic description. Right? You can go more into sort of neural circuitry, and like if you develop these really complicated models of like 5 neurons and 20 million parameters. So here that could be a bit, that could be more feasible, but first we wanted to do the sort of Kuramoto, like sort of abstract stuff, just to get an idea of what it means. But yeah, it seems that the underlying topology has an effect on, so as like information metrics, on how to sustain a steady state. So then the idea is, of course, that you can sort of use that to engineer certain types of circuit that would be good at storing information, or other types of tasks. And there's also, so initially we also thought about citation networks, stuff like that. But there's another context in which that could be useful, is in reverse data and hydrographic basins. Okay. Yeah. So because there you have a doubt by definition, because you have flow, and you can actually study seasonality, for example, because when you have so the actual topology is going to change with time. Like after winter, we have more water flowing, then you have more connections, and in the fall season, much less. Yeah, I don't know if that would apply to like UK-based type things, but in more in country we have like more extremes weather. Yeah, that's something we've been thinking. So actually, we didn't think about that. So yeah, so he's the one who mentioned that, and I should answer his name. That's
You have any more questions? Then I say what time. Thank you everyone for attending online. Close the call. Thank you.